The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There has been a lot going on in Latin America lately, and one of the biggest stories is that the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, has resigned after nearly 14 years in power, and there is major turmoil in Bolivia. And to be perfectly honest, Pat, I've sort of been going back and forth about whether to talk about this on the regular show, because much like with certain issues in the Middle East, there are what am I trying to say? There are minefields that one can step into by talking about these things, even on the left, where it's come to my attention that there are left-wing commentators, according to people in the audience, I've not seen it myself, who are like very much in favor of the Kirchner regime in Argentina, or very much in favor of Morales without even considering the fact that elections there haven't been fair and free, or we know about the contingent that loves Chavez Maduro in Venezuela. So we'll get into the story, but I've been a little hesitant even to get into this stuff on the regular show because it seems like there's little upside.
Can you kind of separate the policy of this guy from the actions that he's taken? So on the one hand, it's not like he was running this oppressive government. It doesn't seem like that. But the fact that he was maybe like counterfeiting the elections, trying to stay in power, trying to continue his presidential term well into the 14th year.
Yes.
Can you criticize that stuff without getting into the specifics of if he's helping the workers, if he's helping the environment there? Shouldn't people be able to delineate those two things?
Well, yes, but at the same time, you can make the argument that even if he did some good things for the environment, that you are in the long term creating a massive turmoil if democracy is not functioning as it is supposed to function, right? And this is the main criticism, that if a president is there due to an unfair election, and then they do some good things, are we saying the ends justify the means, that it's okay to cheat at elections if you then do the right thing? I think that that's what's extremely problematic. And that is forcing some people, Pat, on the left, to basically just blind themselves to the fact that there are major election problems there. Because as long as they can say it's not really clear the election wasn't fair, then they can just continue to say, no, the ends do justify the means.
And I know that you follow South American politics quite closely. Do you think this is someone that you would support if you lived there? Certainly not like the power grabbing stuff, certainly not the electoral, changing around the election results or whatever he may have been involved in. But from a policy standpoint, do you think this is someone you could support?
See, that is a question that is so hard to answer without explaining so much about Latin American politics, because there are all sorts of leaders like Morales in Bolivia, like Kirchner in Argentina, like many others, where if you are presented with a list of policies on paper, you would say, absent an understanding of the coalitions that these individuals are involved in, the corruption, the attacks on democracy, if you just get a list of stuff, you say, that sounds pretty damn good. Yeah, this does sound like somebody that I would be able to support. But then when you see, for example, in Argentina, the way that the Kirchner regime of Cristina, I'm talking about Cristina here, not her late husband, the Cristina Kirchner regime raped and pillaged the country's resources, was involved in all sorts of insanely sketchy stuff with Iran, including preventing full and fair investigations of the Jewish Community Center bombing of the 1990s, for which still no one has been held accountable for, the stealing of money, all of these things. If you just look at the list of policy with Morales, it's like, yeah, it is someone that I could support. When you then have a fuller understanding, then I can't in good faith say, knowing everything that there is known, that this is someone I could support. And this is why Latin American politics, Pat, are just so toxic and complicated.
Do you find it in any way just the least bit heartening that people, even when they may agree with the politician on policy, you may even think that they're doing a good job in office, that when they see that there's a power grab taking place or election rigging taking place, that they're willing to turn against the person in charge, like that they're able to separate maybe what their achievements are on paper, what their policy positions are on paper, from the fact that they're being an authoritarian, that they're not representing the will of the people and they're only in it for themselves?
Well, the thing is that, yes, that is good, but immediately there are allegations of this being a military coup. Anytime a military is involved in the removal of an elected official, it is potentially problematic, and often it is problematic. The idea of, well, it's because the election was not fair makes absolute and total sense. When you bring in the military to enforce that, even if it's not been 100% adjudicated and determined, that's when it starts to get incredibly problematic. And I have people all over my Facebook feed from Latin America saying this is a military coup, and all other facts aside, we cannot, in good faith, support anything that is or approximates a military coup. Period. And we will see what the next step is. There, of course, will now be a power vacuum, and I don't know what the future holds for Bolivia, but very complex times there, similar to complex times in my home country of Argentina as well. As many people in the audience, of course, know, I am left-handed, and left-handedness is not super common. Most people are right-handed, anywhere from 85 to 90-ish% of the population around the world is right-handed. There is no subpopulation group, either in a particular country or region or ethnic group or whatever, where left-handedness dominates, although there are some differences in some populations. And figuring out handedness is actually not as cut and dry as maybe we might imagine, given the relatively advanced state of medical research. It does seem that DNA plays a role. There's a study which looked at the DNA of about 400,000 people in the UK. And what they found is that there are 4 regions of the genome that are generally associated with left-handedness. And 3 out of those 4 relate to brain development and structure. So that's one idea. And there's the sort of biological element. Now, years ago, there were also huge cultural issues with left-handedness, where it was pretty common that if a kid started manipulating objects with their left hand, they would very quickly be taught to become right-handed. And this became more and more prevalent when kids started writing. Typically, I guess that would be kindergarten or first grade is when in school most people start writing. But still, this remains a bit of a mystery because it is a combination of some physiological markers, genetic markers today, with the possibility that there is an evolutionary component. So you could go back and imagine that at some point in human history, maybe handedness was closer to 50-50, but there was some evolutionary advantage that right-handedness conferred, and thus right-handed people became much more likely to live long enough to pass along their genes. And maybe at the time there was a correlation between handedness and through heredity. So it's a very interesting thing, Pat, that now is increasingly irrelevant. I mean, yes, most computer mice are now made that they're sort of ambidextrous, but the ones that are shaped for one hand are shaped for the right hand. Scissors. Those left-handed scissors, I don't know. I was never able to cut anything with them. I always used the right-handed scissors in my left hand, but at least the concept of left-handed scissors exists. But the more time goes, there's less and less advantage to everybody writing with the same hand or manipulating objects with the same hand. It becomes more of a moot point.
Well, it's just fascinating that we don't know why this is, right? I mean, you speculated that maybe there was an evolutionary advantage to people being right-handed back in the day, but we don't necessarily know what that may have been. And I think that really is interesting, especially when it's something that impacts all of our lives every day. I mean, we're all, favoring one hand over another. And it actually, I think the world is more dangerous for lefties because how cars are set up, those are set up for right-handed people primarily. So left-handed people, I think, are more likely to get into an accident. And yeah, there's a scissors thing. Maybe you're more likely to cut yourself with some scissors. Do you ever feel as though you're kind of living on the edge, living in danger because you're left-handed?
No, not really. But there is actually the danger thing. I know you're kidding, but that actually is part of the hypothesis. There's the idea. You would imagine that if left-handedness was just at a flat-out disadvantage, that eventually left-handed people would have died out. But there is something called the fighting hypothesis, which is in the same way that in baseball today, when you are batting against a left-handed pitcher, the release point of the ball is different. The movement is the opposite of what most batters will be accustomed to since most pitchers are right-handed, that there can be an advantage to a good left-handed pitcher. In the same way, it is believed that because in times past when dueling and physical fighting was much more a day-to-day element in human survival, most people were used to fighting against other right-handed people. And all of a sudden, You come up and someone is fighting against you left-handed. Your defense now needs to be reversed to account for the fact that the strong blows or knife attacks or whatever are coming from the opposite side. It's disorienting, and that could give lefties an advantage in fighting, which is one of the theories around which the idea that there's a reason why left-handedness did not disappear. It remains minority, but it didn't disappear because in some areas there is actually an advantage, which is quite an interesting hypothesis, I must say.
Yeah, and I think that you should be proud of your left-handedness because on
Sure.
average, lefties are smarter than righties.
That's right.
Mensa, the Genius organization, I think about 25% of their membership is left-handed, even though only about 10% of the general population is left-handed. And also several of the most recent presidents have been left-handed.
Sure.
That includes Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan. So I think you have a greater chance of success just being left-handed. You should be proud of that.
Imagine if there's an evolutionary explanation for that, which is something like, because a lot of elements in society, including tools and different things, were developed for righties, it pushed lefties away from those vocations and maybe towards others that are more academic in nature. Like, is that a possibility at least?
Yeah, or maybe they had to be adaptive and innovative to be able to work with those tools that were developed for right-handed people.
Sure.
And that exercises a certain part of the brain that they can apply to other aspects of their life. I think that may be true.
So let's talk about ghost messages. And the show is not going all paranormal woo-woo. Ghost messages were sent out to both iPhone and Android users over the last week. And apparently these happened on all cell phone carriers. And this actually happened to me. I'm going to actually pull it up so I can tell people, excuse me, as I hit my microphone. A friend of mine very early last week one day sent me a text message that was just a question mark. And I responded to him saying, "Did you mean to send me something other than a question mark?" And he said, "No." "Did I send you something other than a question mark?" And I said, "No, you just sent me a question mark, but I don't get why." And he said, "Well, you texted me at 5:15 in the morning asking me where at." And I said, "No, I didn't. I've not sent that text to you anytime recently." And he said, "Well, it seems you've been compromised by the Russians." And I didn't really think much else of it other than I did search my message history with this friend and found that in February, possibly even on Valentine's Day, I had sent him the message "where at." So the message that he got last week from me, I had actually last written to him February 14 of 2019. According to a report by The Verge, 168,000 messages were sent out because of what is being described as an internal maintenance cycle. The messages were originally sent on or around Valentine's Day in 2019, but they were never received at the time. And so that message finally got through to my friend, Pat.
Yeah, it's like a time capsule. It's interesting in a certain way. And I guess for you, it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, your friend was probably like, why is this guy texting me at 5 o'clock in the morning?
Right.
That's kind of weird. But for other people, it did create some mass confusion. Like there were people who were maybe dating at the time that these messages were sent. This was Valentine's Day after all. And maybe they've since broken up and who knows what messages are now arriving at these to these people who have broken up now. So that would be kind of concerning. Also, if I guess there are stories of people who have since died sending messages and those getting received about now.
Right.
So that would be kind of weird. It would be like an actual ghost text message in that case.
So I didn't know that the message was never received at the time. So when I actually go back to the conversation, on February 14th, we were making plans for lunch and a time had been suggested for the next day. And my friend said, "That works." And then I said, "Where at?" Never got a response. We now know the reason is the message was never received by my friend. So the next day, the plan was for February 15th. I had to follow up and say, "Hey, so where are we going?" Why? Because the ghost text message had never been received. And now the mystery starts to be fleshed out.
Yeah, and I bet for other people, if they had similar plans, maybe that dinner plan never followed through, and maybe they had to just go without eating.
Yes.
Maybe there was like a severe economic impact from all of this because people were unable to communicate with one another. And I wonder what that economic impact would be. I think you could probably measure that.
Well, there are probably some relationships that have ended as a result of this. Is that not possible, that there was some message that was the key message in the middle of a lover's quarrel? And because one message in that was not sent, the relationship fell apart. I think it's almost guaranteed, at least with one relationship.
Yeah, or like two lovers texting each other, and maybe one just forgets to text the other on Valentine's Day. It turns out they actually didn't forget.
Can you imagine?
But they got the message 8 months later around Veterans Day.
Yes.
I mean, that would be kind of strange.
It would be a sad thing, but unfortunately, when we have this level of reliance in technology, it is anyone's game, and this is why I recommend. What do I recommend? I don't know. Always having landline phone calls if you need to communicate something of importance. I have no clue what I would recommend. But anyway, the mystery of the 168,000 missing text messages has been solved. And that does it for today's bonus show. We will have a new show and a new bonus show tomorrow. And yes, the plan is we will be live streaming, I guess, the entirety of the Trump impeachment inquiry hearings starting Wednesday morning at 9:30 a.m., roughly, if that's when it starts, on our YouTube channel. And I hope you will join us for that.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.